Okay, we'll make a start. For anyone who still hasn't met me, my name's Dave. I'll be your tutor for this semester. So I generally keep notes up for my tutorials on a blog that I keep, and the address for that is dave.if90.net. Okay, and you'll find the notes for today under the KIB216 menu, tutorials, and week 2. And I also generally tend to record my tutorials as well, because I find that we go through a lot of stuff in class and it's easy to tune out for a couple of seconds here and there, so it's a lot easier to be able to go back and rewatch them than having to email me and ask me, oh, what was that thing that you talked about at that point. So I'll try and post those generally the week following the tutorial. Obviously they're definitely not a substitute for turning up, but they have proved useful in the past, so I keep doing them. So today I want to go through a few different things. The first one where I have a post here is about web hosting and domain name registration. So as Deb mentioned in the lecture, for your assignment, for your final assignment this semester, so the assignment's in 2 parts. Basically the whole thing is you're developing a WordPress portfolio. The first half is you develop the design pitch for that, and then the second half is you actually implement and build that portfolio. And we do require you for that second part to actually have your own web hosting and domain name to put that on. So there's a few reasons for that. Primarily, when we talk about that, we say why not just use the Qt web server. I guess the main reason for that is once you leave here, you're not going to have access necessarily to the Qt web server, so your portfolio being stuck on the Qt server is not going to be very useful to you. You can migrate a website across servers, but if you put it in the place that it's going to end up now, then that saves you a lot of trouble and messing around. Also, if you have your portfolio, I mean, you probably will find use for your portfolio. You'll be directing people to it pretty much as soon as you have it. And one of the issues with the Qt web server space is that you require a Qt login to actually view it. So if you had your portfolio on there and you wanted to let anyone see it, you would have to give them your Qt login and password in order to see it, which is obviously not ideal. And then the third reason is that we tend to find that there are some technical restrictions on the Qt web server that make it a little bit difficult to work with WordPress installations on there. So those are the main reasons that we do require you to get your own web hosting. The sooner you get it, the better. We will be doing stuff that you can use it for as early as next week, but you obviously definitely need it by the time you start actually developing your portfolio, your WordPress site. So if you already have your own web hosting, that's fine. You're allowed to use that. That's completely fine. If you don't, and we don't expect that you already do, I guess the first question is, which web hosting company should I go with? I can't really give you any specific recommendations, but I've put links to some articles here on various sites discussing various different web hosting companies. One that a lot of people or a lot of students seem to have gone with in previous semesters is DreamHost. I suspect mostly because they seem to be reasonably cheap and they're sort of a big well-known company. Although I will say that, as with most things in life, you tend to get what you pay for. So if you super cheap out on the hosting, what you probably find is you don't get the fastest web server. So yeah, there's a few links there. I won't go through them now, but I'll let you go through those in your own time. I mean, if you've got friends who've got web hosting, asked around, ask their experience of their web hosting provider. The things that you're really looking for are, obviously how much it's going to cost, but also how good they are at, responding to requests for support and things like that. So they're the kind of things that you're looking out for. In terms of technical requirements for your web server, you'll find this is a screenshot from well, they've updated their page, but from a hosting company called Quadra, and generally all web hosting providers will have a series of plans, much like you'd have internet plans or mobile phone plans that go up in price based on features and bandwidth and stuff like that. What you'll probably find is that you can probably get away with a quite low-end package. The only reason you end up needing to pay lots more money for your web server is usually if it becomes very popular and you have a lot of people visiting the site, and therefore you need a lot more bandwidth for your website. So when it comes to the technical requirements for your web hosting, there's really only two things that you need for the purposes of your portfolio website, and that is the web server has to support PHP and MySQL, and for recent versions of WordPress I've got the version numbers there, but any web hosting company should keep them pretty much up to date. So you just want to look for a web hosting package that has PHP and MySQL. So I mean, if we look at any of these, you should see them listed on here. So you can see if we look at this Quadra hosting one, they've got their web basic package, and if we come down here to scripting technologies, we find that it does not support PHP. And if we have a look for search for MySQL. Okay, down here in databases, MySQL databases does not support those either. Okay, so obviously you couldn't go, if you were going with this web hosting company, you couldn't go with that basics package. But the very next one across does support MySQL and does support PHP. Okay, so here under the MySQL database, that means you're allowed to have up to 10 separate databases. You only need the one for your website, and in fact you could run multiple websites off one database if you want. So 10 is like heaps more than you'll need. Okay, so in terms of cost, then you're probably looking sort of around $10 a month in terms of cost. And as with, again, with internet and mobile phones and things, the longer sort of you pay for, the cheaper it tends to become. So that's the web hosting. And when you do sign up for web hosting, what you'll normally get is an email confirming that you've signed up, and they'll send you a bunch of details with information about how you actually connect to the server and put files on there. Okay, so this is an example of an email from a web host, basically saying here's the URL that you can access your website from. There's a link to an administration interface, and they will usually give you FTP access details, and you use those to log in with an FTP client and actually transfer files to the web server. Okay, but they'll generally give you very detailed instructions. I mean, they'll be dealing with people who have very little technical knowledge, who are buying web hosting services. So, their expectations of what are pretty low. So intelligent, technically minded people like yourself should have no problem really. So that's the first part, and then obviously you need a domain name. So the domain name is the thing that you type into the address bar, obviously, that then goes and points to your website on a web server. The easiest thing to do is to buy your domain name and your web hosting from the same place. That means that it will automatically be set up for you so that the domain name points to your web server. But you can. There's no reason why you can't buy them from separate companies. If you do that, and again, I've got some links here to websites discussing various different domain name registration companies. There's less to look at there. I mean, they provide one service. They give you a domain name. So if you do buy your domain from a separate company to your web hosting, what you will have to do is point the domain name to the web server. So if you see in this setup email, they talk about you'll receive another email containing details how to redelegate your domain name to a new account. In the meantime, you can access your website from the following URL, and they give you this sort of not very short URL, but that's a temporary URL where you can access the website. Once you do set up the domain name, you basically point that to the web server, and then that's the domain name that goes to the website. And again, you'll get instructions on how to do that when you sign up for the domain name, but it generally involves going to the domain name company, logging in with your account details, and then putting in the names of what's called the name servers from your web hosting company. Okay, and I've got a link here to that whole process as well. So I'm happy to help anyone with that process if you have trouble setting that up. But as I said, they generally give you very detailed instructions on how to achieve all that. And if you want to go the super easiest route, as I said, the easiest thing to do is just to buy your hosting and your domain from the same company, and then it should all be set up for you. Okay, are there any more questions about that side of things? There is one more thing I should mention. Sorry, you may find that in terms of the hosting packages, they offer either. Let's see, I've got here. So you might find that they offer both Windows hosting and Unix hosting, and which one you get technically probably doesn't really matter from the point of view of what we're doing. But a lot of people see Windows and go, okay, I know Windows, I'll go for that one, and see Unix and go, oh, Unix, I'll have to know Unix. But actually, in terms of interacting with the web server, it makes no difference to you. And what you will probably find is that the Unix web hosting is cheaper because they don't have to pay licenses for Windows, because the Unix that they use to run the web server will be free. And also, it's actually by far the more common architecture for web servers is to have Unix or Linux running the web server. So don't be afraid of getting a Unix web server. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when you get into web a bit more, and you're doing like several different websites for people, do you just charge the clients and make them set it up on behalf of the web hosting? And do you bill them the $99, or do you create like a multi-one where you host multiple sites?
But you could do any of those options. So you could have a big web server that you pay a bit more money for, because if you have multiple sites on there, you'll obviously be using more bandwidth and stuff. And then you can take charge of basically administering all those sites on behalf of the client, and then you charge them a nominal fee for the upkeep of the server. Or probably what's more common is and I mean, it means you don't have to worry about that stuff as much as you'll buy a separate web hosting and a domain for them, and basically set it up under their name with their payment details, so that you create the site, and once it's done, you know, it's their job to keep paying for it to maintain the hosting and the domain. So if you stop paying for your hosting, they'll obviously will delete your account at some point. They'll probably warn you first, and if you stop paying for your domain name, then that will lapse as well. But they'll send both companies will send you reminders when it gets close to the renewal date to like pay your $10 again to renew your domain, or your $100 for the next year of your web hosting or whatever. Okay. So that is web hosting and domain name registration. Yeah, I'd strongly recommend trying to sort that out this week. If you can have that set up for next week, then you can use that for the activities that we're going to do in class next week. Okay, the next is a post that I just have on web design and development tools, and you may have seen this before, but it's worth sort of going over again. Just some of the tools that, or some of the types of tools that you might find useful in the whole web design, web development process. So the first one is a note-taking tool. If for you that's a pen and paper, that's fine. But there's some good applications that allow you to sort of take notes in nice ways as well. Popular one that I use a lot is Evernote. Has a desktop application and a mobile application. You can sync stuff back and forth. But some way of collating your notes that's different to like the Tumblr or the WordPress blog, where you end up actually publishing things. It is good to have just in its raw format. You can just dump anything you want into there without ever worrying that it's going to see the light of day. But some way of keeping all your notes together. Also, online documentation. Ignore this bit here. That's old. I need to update that, where it says for this unit you will document your work using a Tumblr. I'm not doing that this semester. You'll actually document your work as a blog section on your website ultimately. But you do want to be all the way through documenting your design and development process. And Deb spoke in the lecture to the reasons why that's a good idea. Design and prototyping tools. Okay, there's a few links there. I won't necessarily go through these. If you've got your own tools that you use at the moment already, that's great as well. And feel free to either use or ignore any of these as well. But these are just some of the types of tools that a lot of people find useful. So when we talk about prototyping tools, it's things for doing wireframes and mock-ups and things like that. Code editor obviously is something that's a necessity if you're going to write code. Really, you can write it in whatever you want. You could write it on the command line if you want, or in Notepad. But as you get more into development work, a decent IDE is going to help you. Again, I think these computers have Komodo Edit on them. It appears, yep, Komodo Edit 8. And again, there's just a link here to some various different IDEs. Everyone tends to have their favorite, or jump around between different ones. And my advice is just to try a bunch out until you find one that you like. There's plenty of good ones that you don't have to pay money for, or don't have to pay a lot of money for. So don't feel like you have to splash out hundreds of thousands of dollars on an IDE. FTP client is something that you're definitely going to need for this one, because your website will be stored remotely on a remote web server when you get your web server space. So the FTP client is the program that you need in order to connect to that and transfer files to it. Basically, it ends up becoming like a Finder window or a Windows Explorer window. Just a file interface. The only difference is that instead of transferring files between two different drives or two different places on your hard drive, you're transferring it between two different computers. Okay, so that's why it will look like a file window, okay, with a local computer and a remote computer. But first you need to log in with details, and these are details that you will be given in your setup information when you when you purchase your web hosting. Okay, so it'll be a host, and then you'll have a username and a password. I think in terms of FTP clients that are on here, okay, there's a program on these computers called Core FTP. Okay, but they all tend to operate very similarly. If you want to use one on your own computer, the one I really like, it's free, it's very good, is FileZilla. Very common, very popular, but they're much the same. Web browsers, obviously you're going to want to test in a bunch of different web browsers. Particularly, well, the browser that's particularly popular with web developers for a long time has been Firefox, although Chrome's becoming a lot more popular now, and actually all the browsers now have quite good sort of tools for inspecting the code and helping you develop your websites. One of the best tools for that is Firebug in Firefox, which is this thing here. Again, if you've had me as a tutor before, I'm sure you've seen me use this. And my strong suggestion is that if you haven't already gotten used to using Firebug to look at and inspect your code, then you should put some time into getting used to that, because it's a really, really useful tool for debugging your code and seeing what's going on. Now that's if you use Firefox. If you use Chrome or Safari, or even more recent versions of Internet Explorer, they have similar code inspection tools to Firebug. In Chrome, you find it by going to our View Developer and Developer Tools. Okay, and it shows up a similar thing here, and you'll see me using this a lot when we go through examples in class. And actually, if you've got a recent version of Firefox, then they've actually included their own tools aside from Firebug, so you don't even really need to install the Firebug plugin anymore. Although having said that, I still think Firebug probably does a bunch of things better than any of these other tools, but they're all pretty similar. They generally have a place where you can inspect the HTML. They have a console, which is good for inspecting JavaScript and code and debugging things, and a bunch of other tabs that do various different things. Web Developer Toolbar is another useful one. It's good for doing things like temporarily clearing your cache and a whole bunch of other things to do with that you might want to do when testing a website. So maybe you want to see what it looks like turning off the CSS styles or disabling JavaScript, something like that. But they're the two main development tools that I use, and they're probably the two most popular ones. I don't use Web Developer Toolbar that much, but I definitely use Firebug or equivalent a lot. Just a little section on testing on multiple browsers. Obviously, it's infeasible to install, every version of every browser ever made and test on that. And there's a couple of websites that allow you to basically do that exact thing. So there's one called Browser Shots and one called Adobe Browser Lab. And basically, they let you put in the URL to your website here and check a bunch of different versions of different browsers on different operating systems, and then you hit send, and it will, after a while, it will go away. It'll send those off to a bunch of machines that are actually running those browsers, render the web page, and then send you back a picture of what it looks like, so you can see if your layout's broken on any of those. So this is something I would reserve for the sort of final stages of your development. You don't want to be going through this, because this process takes a little while. You don't want to be going through this every time you make a little change. So my suggestion is you develop in one browser, whether that's and I'd suggest Chrome or Firefox. Test that as you go along. Every now and then jump back and forward to see that it's working nicely in both, and then once you get towards the end of night and it's finished and working well in those, then you can sort of branch out and test in more browsers and platforms. Okay. So there's a lot of links to information there, which you can read through in your own time. It'd be worthwhile having a look at those in more depth. But I'll move on now to a couple of exercises. So this is a new post that I've added recently, based on the last few times that we've done this unit. What I think are the main reasons that people tend to not do as well as they should have done in this unit, and it's generally due to the fact that they can't quite technically figure out how to implement their designs. So they'll come up with beautiful designs that are beautifully laid out, do very well for their initial pitch for their portfolio, and then it comes to implementing the portfolio and they just can't quite get it to work. They can't get things to sit on the page where they want, and so they end up, after having all these grand plans of a nice grid-based layout or whatever, they end up submitting something that just looks like a bunch of stuff vertically stacked on top of each other. And I know that that's not what they wanted to implement, because I can see their original design intentions, but it's generally due to an incomplete understanding of a few CSS concepts. So I've just done up a post here that goes over some of those concepts that I think are not always particularly well understood, and there's more, but these particular ones, if you understand these, I think they will give you much more powerful control over actually implementing the designs that you want to implement in the website. So I've done this basically as a example HTML file, and you can download that from the link here. And you can also view the page with this link here, and it basically looks like this. So I'm just going to open up this folder here, CSS concepts. Now, all this stuff might be old hat to you, and I apologize if that's the case, but I do think it's worthwhile going over, just because I do see so many examples of people who struggle with these, and it really does hinder their ability to implement the really nice designs that they've done. Okay, so let's open this in a browser. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is inline versus block level elements. And really, this is the most fundamental thing about CSS that there is. It's really the first thing that everyone should be taught, but often isn't. And people can go a long way into careers developing, doing front-end development without actually having a proper understanding of what the difference between inline and block level elements is. And there's a really good link here that I've linked to, which gives you more information about that. So this is a really good read. I'd absolutely recommend reading all of these links that I put throughout this example here. Okay, but my example here sort of summarizes it. And the quickest way to summarize the difference between a block level element and an inline element is as such. Well, first of all, we need to know that basically every element in your HTML page is a rectangle. Okay, they call it the CSS box model. Basically, every element has a box, and which defines the amount of space that it takes up. And there's essentially two default behaviors of an element. There's to be a block level element, and there's to be an inline element. A block level element, as it says here, will take up all of the horizontal space available to it. Okay, so a div, for example, is a block level element. When you put a div in there, whether there's a tiny bit of content or a lot of content, doesn't matter. You can see that the actual content within the div ends here, but the div itself, which I have a border around. Okay, so if I jump back to the code, let's see. Okay, here's my div here. It's got a class of border. Should just go through my styles so we can see that. Okay, so I've given a class of border to a bunch of these elements just so that we can see the actual physical space that it takes up. So just a 1 pixel dotted dark grey border. And so that's all this is, a div with some text in it and then the border on it. So the div, being a block level element, takes up all the space available to it. The very next element we put next to it is going to appear underneath. Okay, whereas an inline element, okay, only takes up as much horizontal space as it needs. So this is a span here. Okay, a span by default is an inline element, and you can see that the border only wraps around as much horizontal space as the content requires there. So as it says here, inline elements flow with text. Okay, so the thing we can do with inline elements is basically put them in a horizontal row or within other content, just like I have here. So this here is a span which is inside a paragraph. Okay, so the code for that is, where are we here? Is here. Okay, so there's my paragraph, and there's the span class within it. So the span class being a inline element, okay, is going to be able to sit in there. If I had have made this a div instead of a span, okay, you can see that it all of a sudden becomes a block level element and is forced to take up all of the horizontal space. And then the start and the end of the paragraph is pushed above and below it. Okay, so there's a few other properties of inline and block level elements which you can read about again at this link here, but that's the main one to understand. Okay, a block level element. If you define a block level element, it doesn't matter how big the contents are, it's going to take up all the horizontal width available to it, and the span's only going to take up as much width as is required by the contents. So let me just undo those changes. Okay, and as it says here, by default, there's certain elements that are block level elements and there's certain elements that are span elements. Okay, so a paragraph, for example, is a block level element, as is a div, as is a form, and as is these other HTML5 sections like header and nav, and also lists and list items and headings are also all block level elements. Okay, that's why when you put a heading, even if it's a short heading, it will take up the whole row, and any content then goes below it. Okay, and then inline elements by default, some examples of those are anchor tags, okay, span, and then things that modify the text like bold, emphasis, italics, and then citations, marks, and code. Okay, some lesser used ones. Now the thing to know though about this is that I say these are default behaviors, so that implies that you can reverse them, which you can. You can absolutely override the default behavior of any inline or block element. Okay, so for example, this first div up here. Okay, so this is the div here that I'm talking about. I can set a style on this saying display inline. Okay, and as I've refreshed, you can see that's turned it into an inline element. Okay, and if I was to add another inline element like a span just after it, or let's say I have a heading. And I'll put a border around that heading. Okay, so now I've got a heading after it. Alright, a heading being by default a block level element is going to take up all that space. My div there is still an inline element. If I then go and change this heading to be an inline element as well by giving it a style display inline, okay, then now as long as there's space for it, it's going to sit up there beside the other inline div. Okay, so you can absolutely change the default behavior of any inline or block level element. So let me just undo those changes. So a common example of doing that is the way that we take a bunch of list items and style them so that they look like a horizontal list. Okay, so this is a very common way of styling a horizontal navigation menu. So this is a unordered list here. Okay, in my code, that's this bit of code here. It's an unordered list with just a bunch of list items, item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and without any changes to the styling, okay, other than giving them a border so that we can see how much space they take up. Alright, we can see these list items, okay, these list items all have a border. The list items obviously are block level elements, okay, because even though that text takes up a tiny little bit of space, alright, the list item itself is taking up that entire width there. And let me just move this down here. Alright, I can use my code inspection tool to hover over that and see. Okay, I'm hovering over each of those list items. I can see that it takes up the full amount of space. Now, even if I was to make these list items, if I was to physically set their width, okay, for example, this first one, if I change the width to be, let's say, 100 pixels, okay, it makes that list item 100 pixels wide, but because it's still a block level element, it's still going to use up the entire row. Okay, if we actually want to get these to sit beside each other, we have to change that default behavior of the list item. So the way that we do that is demonstrated by this second list down here. Okay, so as it says here, list items are by default a block level element, therefore they take up all the horizontal space available to them. But we can change this into a horizontal list, sorry, that's a typo there, by changing the display property of the list items to inline. Okay, so I've duplicated this list here, okay, from here to here. It's the exact same code with one exception. I've added this class horizontal list. Okay, and if I jump over to my style sheet, I will find that class. There it is. So here I've told it that any list item inside of the class horizontal list, display those as inline. So override the default display block behavior and display it as inline. Okay, and as soon as we do that, it displays like this. Now, you'll also notice that the little dot points on the list have disappeared. I haven't actually styled those away. For whatever reason, the browser decides to render inline list items without the dot point, without the bullet point. But that's an aside. But the important thing to notice here is that changing these to inline level elements, okay, not only does the border only go around the text now, but they will actually sit beside each other on a line like that. Okay, and that's because we've overridden the default block level display of a list item and changed it to display inline. Okay, so there is one more thing to note about inline elements, and that is as soon as you set a list item, as soon as you set an item to display in line, it will all of a sudden ignore the height and width properties. Okay, so let's just say, for example, I write a style which styles all of my list items to be width 100 pixels and height 30 pixels. Okay, so you can see that that's taken effect on my default list items here that are still block level items. Excuse me. But it's had no effect on these inline items. Even though when I inspect these, okay, I can still see that the width and the height style is being applied. Okay, it makes no difference to these inline displayed items. And that is because if you have an inline element, it will ignore width and height. Now that can be annoying, and there is one more display property that allows you to basically have the best of both worlds. So you can use a display property called inline block, inline hyphen block. And basically that gives you all of the features of an inline element in that they can sit beside each other like that, but it respects the height and the width properties. And surprisingly, this isn't used more often or more well known about. And the only reason I can think of is because it isn't super well supported in old browsers, but it's been around long enough now that it's supported, pretty well in the last few versions of all the major browsers. So if I change this horizontal list from, if I change that from, where are we here? There it is, from display inline to display inline hyphen block. Okay, and I refresh that. There we go. Now they do respect the height and width properties that I've set on them as well. Okay, so that's inline elements versus block level elements. As I said, I definitely recommend reading this article, which goes into that in more detail. But that's the main thing to remember, is basically whether it takes up the entire row of space or only as much as the content demands. Okay, the next section is on floats, which is probably causes more frustration than anything else when you're trying to lay things out on a web page. So basically the problem is, we've all seen this, is that floating elements cause things not to sit where we expect they should. Say it another way, floating elements cause their parent container to collapse. So here, again, I'll just jump back to the code. I'm looking at this section here. Okay, so this section of code here represents basically this part here. So I've got myself a div which just shows again the border so that I can see where it sits, that dotted line border. And inside there I've got another couple of divs, okay, which I've styled just to be boxes here, which just means I've given them a height and a width and a background color. And then I've got a paragraph, okay, and the first box is set to float left. Okay, I've given it this class of float left, which if I look at my style, okay, just applies the style float left, and float right, float right. So there's my div, okay, there's my float left box and my float right box. And often this is a problem that you don't discover straight away, because what will often happen is I will have a lot more content in this div. Okay, and if I have enough content in this div, alright, then it looks fine. It seems to work fine, because the container is surrounding all of that text content. Okay, it only becomes an issue when our floated elements take up more vertical space than the rest of the content. Okay, so if I only have a small amount of content in there, and this is something you have to particularly think about when you're doing dynamic stuff, because if this was a WordPress post, for example, then this text here might be that long, but then another post in the template might only be a couple of lines long. Okay, and in this case, this does happen. Alright, and so we get this problem. Obviously, this container should really take up all the space that's available to it here, but it doesn't. And not only that, but something like this heading here, okay, this heading 5 here, which is a block level element, should sit down here, is suddenly pushed up and sitting above the bottom of these boxes, but also pushed to the right. Okay, so we all know the solution to this is we need to clear the floats on those objects, but one, it's not something that's always that is always easy to identify where we need to do that, and two, there's different ways of doing it, and which one's the best one. Well, the answer to the first one is, when do you need to clear a floats? And the answer is, well, actually always. Anytime you're floating an element, you're going to need to clear that float sometime before the end of its containing element. So what that means is, its containing element is this div here. What I need to do is make sure the floats are cleared before that div is closed. Now there's, and again, if you look at this link here under read more about floats, okay, there's generally three ways that you can go about clearing divs that are listed here. Okay, techniques for clearing floats. Okay, so one method is, I mean, the issue is here with the content. I mean, there's no sort of last element that we can put the clearing element on. So if we wanted to clear something here, what we would have to do generally is put an empty div here, okay, and then put the style clear both on that. Okay, now that would fix this issue. Okay, it fixes that float issue, but it's a bit ugly. It's not really, I don't know, it doesn't look right to have an empty div sitting there for its only purpose being to style something. It sort of goes against the idea of having style and content being separate. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to, well, they call it here the overflow method. Essentially what you can do is, so we'll get rid of that div. Okay, so the problem comes back. Another good way of fixing this is to, on the container element, so the one that's being affected by the floats, if you give that a style of overflow, and if you either give it a style of overflow hidden or overflow auto, alright, then that will also clear the float. Okay, so that's generally a good option a lot of the time, but there might be a case where you don't want that overflow to be set. Maybe for some reason you actually want the overflow to be visible on that container div. So actually the best way of doing this, and there's whole forums dedicated to this that you don't need to read, but the best way is to use what's called a clear fix. And if you've used any sort of CSS framework, you've probably come across something like this. Basically, it's to create a class that looks like this, and this is the CSS for it. Okay, so you give it a name. It's generally called something like clearfix, and then it's got this pseudo selector after. Okay, and it's got a few CSS properties here. It's got content here, and it just puts a character in here. Okay, this is a full stop, but it could be anything. Some people just use an empty string. So what this essentially does, this after pseudo element, is it actually tacks on another element to whatever that class is applied to. Alright, and then it does these other things. It says visibility hidden, display block, height 0, clear both. Doesn't really matter if you don't understand exactly what this does. It's a bit convoluted, but if you use this, and you can find this code anywhere if you just search for clearfix. Basically, I'd suggest any project you have, copy that code and put it in your CSS somewhere as that style clearfix, and then all you have to do is any element where you want to solve this problem here. Okay, if you get that problem, then you simply go to the containing class that's being collapsed and add, along with whatever the other classes you have there, the class clearfix. Okay, and then that will be fixed. Okay, so if you do that, if you put that clearfix rule in your CSS, and anytime you've got HTML where, anytime you've got a container where there will be floated content inside it, just put that clearfix class on there, then you should never run into that collapsing divs problem ever again. Okay, the next section is about margins, padding, and how the dimensions of an element are calculated. Okay, so you'll see articles about this probably talk about the CSS box model. Again, CSS box model basically just saying that every element on a page is a rectangle. Okay, and that bounding rectangle is used to figure out where it sits. And that's complicated a little bit further by the fact that we can add things like margin and padding and borders to elements. So the common complaint here is that we get something like this. So these are two divs that I've got set here in my code. Where are we here? Okay, so I'm looking at this bit of code just here. Okay, so I've got a container div, can ignore that, but I've got these two divs here. Okay, again, which just have a border and they've got some text inside them, and I've given them a class example 1 and example 2. Okay, but the point is both of these divs, okay, I've given, if I find my next one, there it is. Okay, so both these divs in my size example, I've given a width of 200 pixels and a height of 100 pixels and a margin of 1 EM. Okay, that's not important. The height and width are the same. Okay, but they obviously look different sizes. Okay, so the reason for this is the way that the final size of the element is actually calculated. And this is another thing that should really be explained right at the beginning but is often overlooked. Okay, the way that you actually figure out how much space an element is actually going to take up is not just the width and the height that's set to it. You also have to add on to that both the padding and the border as well. Okay, so if we look at these in more detail, okay, this first one here, as well as having a width and a height of a width of 200 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, it also has padding of 1 EM. Okay, now I could make that in terms of calculation. Let's make that instead of 1 EM, let's make it 10 pixels. Makes it easier to calculate for us. Okay, and one of the useful tools again in your code inspection tools is going to be there should be a section where you can see the layout or the size of the element. So if you can see down here, if I hover over this, well, let's hover over the second one here, the smaller one first of all. Okay, and you can see I can hover over the various different parts of that element. So I can hover over the middle bit, okay, which shows me the bit that I've actually defined, okay, the 200 pixel by 100 pixel div. Okay, and then I can hover over the padding. In this case, there's none. There's a border there also of 1 pixel, okay, from that dotted border that I've applied to it, and then there's a margin of 16. So the actual size of this, or the actual width of this, I don't know if you can see, as I hover over there, it shows up here. Okay, it's telling me that the actual width is 202 pixels and the actual height is 102 pixels. So where's it getting those extra 2 pixels from? That's from the border. So if we're looking at the width, there's a 1 pixel left border, there's a 1 pixel right border, and then there's 200 pixels in the middle. Okay, so that's 202 pixels, and then the same with the height. 1 pixel top border, 1 pixel bottom border, and 100 pixels that I've defined for the element. If we go up to the top one, we have to include the padding in that as well. So in this case, there's my 200 by 100 pixel div. Add on to that 10 pixels of padding plus the 1 pixel border, and then it ends up being 222 pixels by 122 pixels. Okay, so you have to keep in mind, this is especially important when you're laying things out in a row. Okay, if you've say got a container which is 600 pixels wide and you're expecting to fit 3 200 pixel objects within that, you might do that, but then you might decide to go and add some padding. All of a sudden they don't fit, okay, because the padding makes each of those take up more than a third of that 600 pixels. Now the interesting thing to note here is that the margin doesn't make a difference. Okay, so the padding and the border are included in calculating its actual width, but the margin is not. Okay, so even though both of these have a margin of 1 EM, or I could have made that a certain number of pixels, it doesn't make a difference in calculating the dimensions of that element for purposes of laying it out on the screen. Okay, and that's because basically the padding, as you can see here, the padding gets put sort of inside the border and the margin is outside. So a margin is space around an element, padding is space within an element. So the outermost thing that gets included in the calculation of the size is the border. Okay, and the last example is positioning. Okay, so this is one of the more difficult things to understand about CSS, but again, not that difficult. And if you do understand it, you got so much more ability to lay things out on the page. So you've probably used positioning stuff before. You've probably used positioning relative to nudge things around maybe, or positioning absolute to stick something to the top left of the screen or something. But you may not have completely understood exactly what was going on there. So the first thing to understand is that every element has a default position property applied to it, and that default position you've probably never even heard of. It's called static, and basically the position static means don't do anything, just let it sit where it's meant to sit within the flow of the HTML page. And to change that is why we set a position to something else. Okay, so we can override that just like we just overrode the default inline or block level element on it by using a CSS selector. Okay, we can override the default positioning setting. So position relative is the easiest one to understand. So the first one we'll look at. So if you specify position relative, basically what you're saying is, okay, position it statically, but then move it from where it would otherwise be by this amount. Okay, so again, this link here has excellent visual examples of that. So I might use theirs for the position relative. Okay, so this is with everything positioned. This is the example here. This is with everything positioned statically. Okay, it just sits where it would otherwise be. With position relative, okay, they've got this div1 set to position relative, and then they've got values of top 20 pixels and left minus 40 pixels. Okay, so this black square here is that div1. So basically when you set it to position relative, it says, okay, put it where it would be, but then move it based on what I set, either the top, left, bottom, or right parameters. So this is saying where it would otherwise be, add 20 pixels from the top. Okay, so we can see it's moved down 20 pixels from the top, and move it minus 40 pixels from where it would otherwise be on the left. Okay, so that's across there, minus 40 pixels. So this is an interesting thing to note, that you can actually use negative values for here. Okay, so if I wanted to move it up, I could say move it minus 20 pixels from the top. If I want to move it to the right, I can say left plus 40 pixels. Okay, so that's relative position. That one's not too difficult to understand. Then we've got position absolute. When you position something absolutely, okay, there's two ways of describing this. Okay, there's the easy way, which is slightly wrong, and then there's the long way, which I'll give you. The easy way is to say, if we position something absolute, it takes it out of the flow of the elements altogether, and it positions it in relation to the window. So if we take something, let's just add something to the code here. Let's go. Okay, let's create a div box here. Okay, so I've just created this new div here. Okay, it's just a box. Okay, so that's positioned statically by default. Okay, I can change it to well, let's do it in the in the browser here so we can see it immediately. Okay, so I'm going to write here position relative. So we'll do this first. Position relative. If I just do that, you see nothing changes, okay, because I'm positioning it relative, but I haven't told it where to sit. So here I can say top. If I want to move it up, I'll say minus and then the amount. Let's say minus 20 pixels. I can actually type. Okay, minus 20 pixels. And left, let's say move it over to the right 200 pixels. Okay, or let's say I want it to sit all the way, no, sorry, actually that'll do for that example. Okay, so that's positioning that relative. Now let's get rid of those last two, and I'll change this position to absolute. And I'm sure you've seen what happens when we do that. Okay, so what I'll do is, first of all, I can say top 0 and left 0. Okay, then I have to go and find where it is. Okay, it's jumped up to the very top left of the window. Okay, so this is sort of like positioning it relative to the actual window. So I can actually push it up beyond the top of the window by saying, again, something like top minus 20 pixels. Okay, that pushes it up. And I can push it over to the right by saying left 200 pixels, for example. I could sit it all the way over on the right by, instead of saying left, using the right parameter and setting that 0. So I can position it from the right side as well as I could do it from the bottom side. Okay, so that's what positioning absolute does normally. Okay, and that's the simple definition of it. But that's not really the most useful way of using it. Actually, the most useful way of using absolute positioning is to combine it with relative positioning. And so, actually, the correct definition of using position absolute is to say that if you specify position absolute, then the element is positioned relative to its closest parent with position relative. If there's no ancestor with position relative, the absolutely positioned element is positioned relative to the browser window. Okay, so that's the complex explanation. But basically what that's saying is, yes, it's going to position it relatively to the window, but it's only going to do that if it doesn't have a container element with position relative. So we can do something much more useful with this once we understand that. So let me get rid of this div here, and let's look at this example container here. Okay, so I've got my container div, and sorry, this div here, the position example container, is the one that you see with the dotted border around it here. And then inside of that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 box divs, and they've got different settings. They've all got position absolute, but they've also got different settings from top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right, and top and left, to position them in various different places. Now you can see that even though there's a positioned absolute, they're not being positioned in relation to the browser window. They're actually being positioned in relation to this div. And the reason for that is because that div itself has a position of relative. If I don't have that, if I get rid of that on that container div, okay, then all of a sudden these get positioned in relation to the browser window. Okay, but it's not very often that you're going to want to position things in relation to the browser window. It's much more often that you're going to want to position things in relation to their parent container. So all you need to know is that in order to have the child elements positioned absolutely in relation to the container, is just make that container position relative. You don't need to give it any top, bottom, left, right parameters. Just set the container element to be position relative. And then anything that's positioned absolutely within that is going to position relative to that container. So this one here, Okay, this div here I can see is position absolute, top 0, left 0, okay, which puts it in the top left. This one here is position absolute, top 0, right 0, okay, which puts it in the top right. This one here is going to be bottom 0, left 0. This one here is going to be bottom 0, right 0, put it in the bottom right. And then this one here, to put it in the middle, is position absolute, top 150 pixels, left 250 pixels. Now the way to calculate that is simply, I know that this div here is, well, let's see, how wide is it? Okay, it's 600 pixels wide and 400 pixels tall. Okay, so initially you might think we should, if we want to center this div, to put it at half of 400, which is 200 pixels, and half of 600, which is 300 pixels. Let me modify you, there we go. Okay, but you can see what that does is it indeed positions it in the middle, but it's obviously positioning it from the top left of that. So all I've done is subtracted half of the width from that and half of the height from that to come up with 150 pixels and 250 pixels. And that sits it in the dead center. Okay, so in this way, I mean, without knowing that, you're quite restricted to how you can actually position things within a container. You can nudge things around with margins and stuff, but then they start to bump other things out of the way. Knowing this, they call it a trick. It's not really a trick. It's a thing. You're meant to use it. But knowing this allows you to position things within a container element a lot more accurately. So something as simple as having, let's say you've got a a heading element. So we'll go to this div and ID header and style equals width. Sorry, we'll give it a fixed height of something reasonably big, 300 pixels. And then inside this we'll have a box that can be our logo, and we'll have a heading, let's just see what that looks like. Okay, so let's just say this is a header here. Okay, and it's a little bit big actually. Let's make it whoop. So we've got a heading here, and let's just say for whatever reason we want to position both these things at the bottom of the header. Okay, then one way we could do it would be to figure out how much space there is and put some margin up there. But then that becomes an issue if we want to then change the height of that header. We have to go and figure out those values again. So an easier way of doing this would simply be to just make the header itself position relative, and then set the position of the box. Okay, that might be a logo or something. Okay, we can set the position of that to be absolute, and then set it left 0 and bottom 0. Okay, and we could do a similar thing for the heading here. So let's just say I want this heading to sit actually over here on the right. Okay, so what I can do is, for this heading, set a style of, again, position absolute, and right 0, bottom 0. Okay, and then it sits over there like that. Okay, and then if I want to go and change the height of the heading, let's say I want to go and make it another 100 pixels taller, I don't have to go adjusting margins or mucking around with any of that. It still just sits exactly where I've told it to. Okay, so again, I'd suggest looking at this. This is a really good visual example explaining exactly that stuff in more detail. Okay, and a few other things. The other link I've got here is a really good article which basically covers how to center anything in any context on an HTML page. Okay, that's one thing that often is very frustrating, getting things to center, particularly if you've got fluid designs and you can't beforehand know the exact dimensions of things. So this is a really good article on that, explaining how to center basically anything within anything using CSS. Okay, so that's that example there. If nothing that I've gone over there was new to you, then excellent. If anything was, though, I would thoroughly recommend reading through those links and playing around with that yourself. Make as many mistakes as you can in the exercises before you get to implementing your website, and then you'll have a much better time with that. Okay, so the last thing I want to look at today is basically I'm setting you an exercise. So it's an HTML CSS exercise. If you're in my class last semester in 205, you might have already done this, but I want you to do it again because we're going to need this for the exercise for next week. But essentially, it's just to prove to yourselves that that you can still do an HTML layout for a simple page. So what I want you to do is essentially create a page that looks something like this. Not in terms of style, you can style it however you want, but in terms of layout, I want you to have, well, basically I've listed off the things here. So I want you to create a static HTML5 page with the following: a center-aligned layout. I want you to include a tiled background image for the page body. I want it to have a header section which contains a logo image that links back to that page. You can use a placeholder image, don't worry about creating a logo. A heading 1 for the site name, and I want you to align this to the bottom of the bottom right of the header. Okay, hint hint, just like I showed you then. I want a horizontal main navigation which uses a unordered list. Okay, again, I showed you how to do that just a little while ago by making those list items inline. I want it to have hover and active / current link states, and I want then a 2 or 3 column content section containing a sidebar and a content area. Or 2 sidebars in a content area if you want to do 3 columns. I'd probably just do 2 columns. And then just have some content in there. Within the sidebar, I've said here have a vertical submenu. I don't really care. Just have some content in the sidebar. In the main content area, I just want you to have some paragraphs of text, but so that you can practice floats and clearing floats. Okay, I want you to have a right aligned or a right floated image and a left floated image, and I want you to give one of those images a caption, like as shown here. Again, I don't care how you style it, but I want there to be a caption. So that will likely be a div with some sort of styling with an image inside it and then some text underneath there. And then finally a footer section where you have a copyright notice and contact details with a mail to email address link. Okay, so it should look something, in terms of layout, not necessarily styling, it should look something like this. Okay, and then what we're going to do next week is, so if you don't finish this off today, finish it off before next week, and then we'll bring that back, and what we're going to do then is looking at So next week's going to be all about, we're going to start looking at dynamic websites as opposed to static websites. So what we're going to do is take this static website, and I'm going to show you how we can basically cut it up into a bunch of PHP files and then create more pages, but using each little component so that we don't have to recreate them. So for example, we'll create a file which just represents the header and the navigation. So then when we create another page, rather than having to recreate all that, we just include that one header part. And then that extends on to basically exactly how WordPress templating works. We end up having a page which is cut up into a bunch of different modular sections, and we pull those all back together. Okay, but for today, all I want you to do is create the static example of this web page, and I'll post an example of the code for that at some point before next week. But I just want to make sure that you have a go yourself first. And once you've gone through all of that, if you finish all of that, you can do these HTML CSS quizzes on W3 Schools, just to make sure that your HTML CSS knowledge is up to snuff. And then, of course, if you are struggling with any HTML or CSS concepts, you really want to sort those out early on, because other concepts are going to be harder to understand if you don't have them sorted out. So I've got links back to so the classic W3 School sections on HTML and CSS. If you do need to go over those, make sure you go over those this week if you need to. I've also got one more link down here which sort of relates to my example. There's a link here to a site called learnlayout.com, and this is another really excellent visual example going over a lot of the stuff that I talked about, but again in more detail in terms of CSS layout. And as I've said, I keep coming back to what layout and an understanding of how to lay out elements using CSS is by far the most common place where people fall down in being able to implement their design. So an understanding of this is going to help you, I guarantee, more than anything else that you could do to prepare for the weeks coming ahead.